Now that we've seen how diverse forensic science is and have talked about the different units that may be present in a forensic science lab, let's take a look at identification and individualization. So one task for forensic scientists is identifying things. If something is found at a crime scene, can they answer the question, what is it? Now, sometimes this is going to be easy simply by looking at it. Other times, this might need a battery of chemical or biological tests to determine what this item is and whether it's relevant. Well, after an item has been identified, then can it be classified? So this is class characteristics. These are characteristics that put an object in a certain subgroup or class. However, it doesn't mean we're going down to determining a single source for that object. An example, for instance, would be a shoe. A shoe is obviously a shoe, but what brand of shoe is it? What type of shoe is it? Is it a man's shoe or a lady's shoe? If you find a fiber at a crime scene, what kind of fiber is it? Is it a cotton fiber, a wool fiber, a nylon fiber, etc.? If you find a bullet at a crime scene, what kind of bullet is it? Particularly, what caliber bullet is it? So these are class characteristics, and these start to narrow down the object in question. Now, ideally, what we want to get to is individualization. That is where you start from a classification and you narrow it down to one. So you identify it as a brand of shoe, and then you narrow it down to a particular person's shoe. This, of course, is not always going to be possible, but it's something that we strive to do. So for a physical object, for instance, such as a shoe or an item of clothing, you might find out who is the manufacturer. If it's, for instance, a tool, you might look for the serial number, and objects may carry fingerprints on them. If it's something of chemical origin, then you might look at trace elements or impurities within that object to do this narrowing down. And for biological samples, blood, for instance, you will try to individualize it by using the blood type or by DNA analysis. Let's look at an example of individualization. And the example we're going to take is the fairy story Cinderella. So most of you will be familiar with this story from when you were small. And essentially the story is that the prince decided to have a ball. All the ladies, the young ladies in the town, were invited because he wanted to marry one of them, so he wanted to meet them all. But Cinderella couldn't go to the ball because she was too poor and she had nothing to wear. However, at the last moment, her fairy godmother appeared and by magic provided a gown and a carriage and all that kind of stuff. And Cinderella could go to the ball and could dance with the prince. And of course, the prince fell in love with her. But the magic was going to expire at midnight. So just before midnight, Cinderella rushed out of the room before her beautiful gown turned back into her normal rags. And of course, the prince had fallen in love with her, but didn't know who she was. So he had to investigate and find out who this lady was. None of the eyewitnesses were any use, because none of them had ever seen Cinderella dressed like this before, and so could not recognize her. So he could not rely on any eyewitnesses. So what did he do? He turned to forensic science. He had to examine any traces left by Cinderella in the ballroom. And as we know, she left a very significant trace. As she rushed out of the room, one of her shoes came off. And in the story, it is a glass shoe. Now this, of course, is very improbable. It's a ridiculous material to make a shoe of, but it does make a nice fairy story. The reason she's wearing a glass shoe, it has been suggested that it is a confusion between the French word for glass and the French word for squirrel fur. But of course, you can't have someone in a fairy story wearing parts of a cute, fluffy animal. So it's a good thing it's a glass slipper. Glass can be analyzed forensically very well. A lot of glass objects, of course, have some kind of code number or identifying number and the manufacturer's mark. So if it has that, you can then go to the manufacturer and find out who they sent those products to, which shops or vendors had those products, and then from their records you could find who had bought those. Of course, this is a magic glass shoe. It comes from a fairy godmother, so that couldn't be done. You can also do a physical investigation of glass. One of the characteristics of glass is the density of the glass. So if you measure the density of the glass, you can find out what kind of glass it is, and then again you can go to the companies that manufacture those particular kinds of glass. In the fairy story, however, these techniques were not available to the prince. So what he employed was a technique that we will see again in later lectures. When you come in a later lecture to the Peter Griffiths case and also to the Colin Pitchfork case, you will see this technique being used. So what the prince did was a mass screening of all of the people in the city. So first of all, of course, he can exclude all the men. So he only has to screen all of the women, and of course only has to screen the young women. So he sent his officials with the glass slipper out to find a woman whose foot would fit inside. And of course the only one whose foot fitted was Cinderella. So they got married and lived happily ever after. Of course, nowadays we know that this technique of finding out whose foot would fit into the shoe is really not very good. And if you read up about what happened in the O.J. Simpson trial, and of course if you watch the associated Seinfeld episode, you will know this is not a very reliable technique. And nowadays, of course, if you wanted to know who that shoe would belong to, you would try and get some DNA from the inside of the shoe and do a match in that way. But of course that technology wasn't available to the prince. So there is an example of individualization of an object. The shoe left in the ball being individualized to be the shoe that belongs to Cinderella. So we come back to this idea of comparison leading to association. On the left is our crime scene that you saw before. On the right is our suspect, who again you saw before. So evidence found at the crime scene would be compared to evidence found on the suspect, and similarly vice versa. And if those comparisons are successful, then you can associate that suspect with that crime scene. Now, we have said that forensic science is about reconstructing the events that happened in the past, and that is gaining an understanding of the sequence of past events, essentially so that you can tell the story of how the incident occurred. This, of course, is not the same as reenactment. Reenactment may be part of reconstruction, but reenactment is taking it further, where you actually go back and you redo one of the events. You might use reenactment when the events include something that is beyond your normal experience, or where there's some special phenomenon that you want to test. And it's only by reenacting it that you can be sure of what really happened. Reenactment came in during the trial for the 2005 London bombings. So you may recall that in July 7th, 2005, 4 bombs exploded on public transport in the city of London, causing great injuries and death. In fact, 52 people were killed in that incident. What is less well remembered is that 2 weeks later there was a repeat event. 4 bombs were detonated on public transport, but on this occasion the bombs did not explode properly, and the terrorists could be arrested. Now, a couple of days later, a 5th bomb was discovered, and this bomb had been abandoned in West London. And it's from this 5th bomb that the forensic scientists were able to know exactly how these bombs had been constructed and what they were made of. And as you can see from the very simple diagram there, they included a detonator embedded in a quantity of homemade explosive. Now the 5 bombers are shown here, 4 of them who had actually attempted to detonate their bombs, and 1 who had abandoned his bomb. And there were numerous forensic links and CCTV evidence to show that these 5 people were the bombers. So when this came to court and the defense lawyers for these people had to come up with a defense, it was simply not possible for them to claim that these people had not been trying to detonate these bombs. So the defense they came up with was concerned with the motive. And the defense they came up with was that these bombs were not real bombs intended to kill and maim people and cause destruction. These bombs were just hoax bombs. And that's why they didn't really explode. They were hoax bombs, and it was just a protest of government's policy. So really the case comes down to mens rea. What was the intention of these people? Well, in the earlier section, we said that forensic science is usually not very good at determining aspects of mens rea. But in this case, it turned out it could. And it comes down to a question of the construction of the bomb. Were the bombs built for hoaxes, or were they really built in order to cause destruction? The 5th bomb enabled the forensic scientists to reconstruct one of these bombs and then do a reenactment of the explosion. So clearly, this wasn't a hoax. This was an intention to cause death and destruction. A much earlier example of reenactment comes from the case of George Smith, and this is the famous brides in the bath case. Now, Smith, it seems, had worked out he could earn a living by marrying women, stealing their money, and murdering them. But his scheme came unraveling in 1914 with the death of his wife, Margaret Lloyd, who drowned in her bath, leaving him £700 of insurance money. And somebody realized that it had happened before. The same thing had happened before to Alice Smith in 1913 and to Bessie Williams into 1912. And all the women had died in the same way. They had been taking a bath and apparently had had an epileptic fit in the bath, and this had caused them to drown without leaving any signs of a struggle or bruising on the body. Now, if it happens once, it's believable. But when it had happened so many times, and it turns out that George Smith had married a total of 7 women, there were suspicions. And the question comes down to, did those 3 women really drown accidentally in the bath due to an epileptic fit, or were they somehow drowned? Now, if someone's in the bath and you try to drown them by pushing their head underwater, they're going to struggle, and that is a violent struggle. And that would leave a lot of bruising. And there was no bruising on these bodies. And then the idea came about that maybe Smith had used a very clever technique for drowning these women. And that is by grabbing their feet and pulling violently on their feet so that their head went very suddenly underwater and the water would rush up their nose. And the suggestion was that that would cause rapid unconsciousness without any signs of a struggle. Well, how do you tell? Well, the man called in to investigate this aspect was someone we met already in this course, Sir Bernard Spilsbury. And Sir Bernard decided the only way to test this theory was by reenactment. So he got some lady divers to volunteer. They got in the bath, he pulled their feet, their heads went underwater, and sure enough, they rapidly became unconscious without any struggle. It was a very effective technique, and it was apparently quite difficult to revive some of these volunteers afterwards. Fortunately, they were all revived. Of course, George Smith's victims were never revived, and so George Smith was convicted of murder, and he was sent to hang. Now, your reenactment, of course, is only going to be as good as the people doing the reenactment. So this is a very curious case which hinges on a reenactment, and that is the death of Gareth Williams back recently in 2010. And it became a big story in the media, probably because of Gareth Williams' occupation. He was a cryptographer working for British intelligence. And he was found in his apartment in August of that year, and he had been dead for 9 days. When the apartment was investigated and when the body was examined, there was no signs of any struggle, there was no traces of poisoning, and there was no sign of asphyxiation. Now, where was the body found? It was in a sports bag like the one pictured, not a very big sports bag. It was padlocked, and it was padlocked on the outside, and it was in the bath. So if you look at the situation, then surely Gareth Williams must have been locked in the bag by someone, because the lock was on the outside. But how do you prove this? So some yoga experts were brought in to reenact this scene, to find out whether someone could lock themselves in a bag and padlock themselves on the outside. And the yoga experts were unable to do this. So the coroner, doing the investigation, concluded that Gareth Williams could not have locked himself in the bag. However, if you go on YouTube, you can find another reenactment of this situation, where somebody succeeds in locking themselves into the bag because they know the trick of how to do the padlocking. So what's the truth in the Gareth Williams case? Well, you go on YouTube, you can find the videos, you can watch them for yourselves and make your own decision. All I'll say is, please do not try this at home. Possibly the most famous case involving a reenactment is the so-called Woodchipper murder case involving Richard and Helly Crafts. So Helly was a stewardess for an airline and Richard was a pilot. They met in 1969 and after a while they got married. Now Richard was an airline pilot and he earned a good living, so he could indulge himself in all sorts of hobbies. He collected guns, he collected machinery, he traveled a lot, and he was even a volunteer police officer in his town and equipped his own police car. And maybe because of all this, the family was having trouble with money. So Helly was also becoming suspicious of her husband, and she hired a private detective to check up on him. And the private detective turns out to be very important in this story. Well, let's go to November the 18th, 1986. This was a very snowy day. They lived in Connecticut, where you can get a lot of snow. And Helly was dropped off at her home after work, and there was already 5 inches of snow on the ground. The next day, when anyone called the Crafts' house, only Richard would ever answer the phone. Helly didn't answer the phone that day. And on the early morning of November the 19th, Richard took their children and the children's nanny to his sister's house, and then he went back to their home. Now, by December the 1st, nearly 2 weeks later, Helly's private detective is starting to get worried because he hasn't heard from her for some time. And he contacts the police and gets them to investigate the case. Now, when the police come to talk to Richard Crafts, who of course is someone they know very well because he's been a volunteer in their department, Richard claims that his wife has disappeared. She's run off somewhere. And they even get Richard to take a polygraph, a lie detector test, which he passes. On searching the house, they find some carpet fragments, but they don't find any blood on them. But they do find that Richard has been making some rather strange purchases recently. For instance, he rented a chainsaw, he'd bought a brand new freezer, and he had also rented a woodchipper machine. And when the police go around making their inquiries in the neighborhood, a witness says that he saw a woodchipper being used down by the local lake, Lake Zoar. Now remember, this is November. There's 5 inches of snow on the ground. Who'd be out doing wood chipping in that kind of weather? Well, the investigation came to a climax on Christmas Day when the police searched Richard Craft's house. And on the mattress, they found bloodstains. And when the blood type of those stains was taken, it matched Helly's blood type, which is O positive. This led them to think that some violent event had overcome Helly Crafts, and so the search became more serious. Now they had the witness placing the woodchipper down on Lake Zoar, so they searched the riverbank around the lake, and they found some human hair, they found some letters, and then they decided to search the lake. Now this is not a real lake, it's a reservoir with a dam, so the people who managed the dam arranged it so that the lake level was lowered and the thing could be searched more easily. Now, what did they find in the lake? They found a chainsaw. In the chainsaw, there were traces of human tissue, human hair, and also blue clothing fibers. They were able to get the serial number of the chainsaw, and it turns out that this chainsaw had been the one used by Richard Crafts. In the lake, they also found 2,660 strands of bleached human hair, which matches Helly's hair color. They found 69 slivers of human bone, and they could get a blood type from that bone, and again, that was O positive. They found some blood. They found 2 teeth, one of which they could confirm was Helly's. They found a piece of human skull. They found 3 ounces of human tissue, and the largest piece they found was part of a finger, shown here on the right-hand side. They also found a fingernail and part of a toenail. So at this point, they had enough material found in the lake to conclude that Helly Crafts had been murdered. In January, Richard Crafts was arrested, and bail was posted at the very large sum of $750,000. The police then set about reconstructing how Richard Crafts killed his wife. Now remember that drops of blood had been found in the bedroom, so they suggested that she'd been beaten to death in the bedroom during the early morning of November the 19th. Now the police then suggested that Crafts had put his wife's body in the freezer to preserve it while he prepared for its disposal. Now, he had made up a story about some electricity problem, and he'd used this as an excuse to take the children and the nanny to his sister's house, which is in Westport down the road. So he dropped the children and the nanny off at Westport, and then he'd return to his own home back in Newtown. Now, of course, he was alone in the house, and he could do whatever he wanted. It's believed that he took Helly's frozen body to a secluded property that he had outside Newtown, and he used the chainsaw to cut up the body into smaller parcels. Then later, under the cover of darkness, it's believed that Crafts took the parts of the body down to Lake Zoar, where he used the woodchipper to cut them up even smaller. Now, what needs to be reenacted? What part of this story is beyond our normal experience? And it's a very simple question. What is the effect of a woodchipper on a human body? So in order to investigate this, the police decided to use a reconstruction. Now, obviously, they can't call for volunteers, and what they used was the carcass of a pig. So they used the same chainsaw, and they put the pig carcass through a wood chipper machine. And here's the results. On the left, there's the wood chipper, and on the right, you can see what's left of the pig. And in the center of the picture, you can see the very distinguished forensic scientist, Henry Lee, who was called in on this case. So you can see from this picture here very clearly that the kind of material, the kind of human material that they found in the lake is consistent with the effects of a wood chipper. So if we look at all this evidence, and there's a network of evidence, you can see that Heli is linked to the chainsaw by the hair and the tissue and the fibers. Richard is linked to the chainsaw by the rental record after reading the serial number. Heli is linked to the wood chipper by hair and tissue. Richard is linked to the wood chipper by the rental. Heli is linked to the lake by the body parts and the tooth found in the lake. And of course the witness places the wood chipper at the lake. So the result was that Richard Crafts was convicted of murder. He was sentenced to 50 years in prison, and he is still in prison today. So in this first introduction lecture, we've covered a lot of material. You've seen some of the different types of forensic work, and some of these we'll go into in more detail in later lectures. You've seen this idea of comparison and association, and you've seen some examples of reconstruction and reenactment. But from this introduction lecture, if you only take home one message, that message should be Locard's principle, that every contact leaves a trace.